I'd first like to take a quick moment, thank everybody here for coming out to hear local writers, storytelling, and also to support a great cause that Kim took it upon herself to organize. Thanks. With an open world available to them, my early relatives came to this country from all over Scandinavia and found this Dakota soil to their liking. My hometown of Garrettson began as the village of Palisades, and its original location is now the Palisades State Park on the banks of the Split Rock Creek. My grandmother's grandfather, Marcus Wanksness, moved to the village of the Palisades with his bride from Michigan, and they started a mercantile business. The town was built right along the railroad tracks surrounding a sawmill, and the community flourished for a number of years and was becoming an established stop on the route between Sioux Falls and Willmar. But after a spring flooding took out that wooden dam that powered the sawmill, Sioux City banker and businessman Arthur Garrettson gathered investors and worked in coordination with his own business, the Northern Railway, and bought up a section of land to the north, about 3 miles. He ran his railway from Northern Railway to meet up with the existing land between Sioux City and Willmar at that point. People were quick to jump onto the opportunity to become part of the new formed town. The city of Garrettson was born. It was still the same town, but also a new town, and hopefully a better town. Seeing the certain demise of their community at the Palisades in the not too distant future, my great-great-grandfather pulled up stakes and took a chance on this newly formed town and was one of the first buildings to plant its foundation on the new Main Street. Eventually, all the businesses moved in except the sawmill, of course. A few years later, Marcus's daughter Bertha married Ole Johnson, and they started Johnson Drug. My ancestors continued to survive and thrive in the growing community. They led the way and became pillars of different aspects of local society: education, church, government, and in business. They found their way to combining their genes eventually to making me. I came into the picture when my dad had taken over the drugstore as the third generation of pharmacists. I grew up in that drugstore. My primary job was comic book inspector and quality control supervisor of the candy section. I had a few other tasks, of course, that helped me earn my allowance. I emptied the garbages, I straightened the cards and envelopes, I dusted, and of course I pushed the hokey around. Quick aside. Now, if you guys don't know what a hokey is, it's a square, you gotta think about a square little powerless Roomba that had a stick. It was powered, but it was powered by a little kid hopped up on candy. Most often, though, I would stand to the side behind the pharmacy counter out of my dad's way and watch with widened eyes as he would fill the prescriptions. He'd count them out with quick and amazing accuracy for the ill people of town. He'd pour out a large number of pills on this little blue tray, if you've never seen a pharmacist work. And then with a deft hand and a palette knife, he'd count them out: 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, 30. And then he'd snap the lid over those counted out pills, pour the excess back into the big bottle, and he'd pour the little ones into the little orange bottle. And he'd throw a white cap on, and he'd roll that label across the front. Over and over again, he'd repeat that procedure. Sometimes the pills were big and he'd count by 2s. Sometimes they were little pills and he'd count by 4s or 5s. It never got old watching him, and I always tried to keep up the count in my head. I would always try to guess where he was at with his count and see if on the bottle then if I was right on with him, and I never got it right. I would go home and I would try to imitate his routine with M&Ms on a butter knife. I'd usually get distracted by the chocolatey goodness waiting for me, and I'd end up overdosing on them. I'd exceed the recommended dosage. I grew up with every intention of following in his footsteps and being the 4th generation owner and pharmacist in that store. But things changed. Life changed. One bad chemistry lab teacher at college, and I immediately switched from a major that focused on science to one that focused on art. That's a whole different story. I found myself 25 years later on an October Saturday afternoon sitting up in a revitalized and vibrant northeast Minneapolis, just across the river from downtown, having an excellent craft beer with excellent new friends. I sat in a former brick fortress of agriculture, and I admired the old architecture, the bricks and the beams. They once housed giant factories grinding the grains of the prairie into food for the world, and now they are the center of regional beer brewing and budding artist studios. I drove home from Minneapolis with a fresh memory of those buildings stuck in my head. I thought about the network of railroad lines that split and spread through every block and sliced up those neighborhoods. These old lines that connected the factories to the world. The lines funneled into switch yards that took the products north to Duluth, to waiting ships, and that took the harvest out to the world. I thought about the lines of people standing in the cool October rain on that Saturday afternoon, waiting to get into those breweries and imbibe on the fermented brews. I thought about the history of those behemoths of agriculture. Something seemed familiar to me. Then it hit me. I began to remember my roots. I remember being behind Johnson Drug, waiting patiently for my dad to finish up his last prescription fills for the day so we could get home for dinner. He said he'd be just a bit, so I would go out back by the truck and waited patiently on the concrete steps. Behind the drugstore was the co-op grain elevator. It ran north to south for about 2 blocks, starting with 4 monstrous cylindrical bins on the north end, an elevator and some smaller bins in the middle, and a supply store and a lumber yard to the south. I stood there staring at the whirring beast as tractors pulling trailers and trucks all filled to the brim with golden heaps of corn lined up for more than a block to feed their bounty into the elevator's waiting belly. They'd roll into a covered area at one end, and then minutes later they'd come out empty and speed back out into the field as fast as a tractor could go. The seemingly endless supply of corn provided the community with an aroma that was reminiscent of warm popcorn that mixed with the smells of the mowed grass and mulched leaves of fall. There'd also be little pieces of corn chaff floating in the wind and whirling into little pink drifts behind the businesses that looked away from the elevator. Hundreds of sparrows would swarm around picking up little pieces of broken corn. I took this all in as the sun lowered behind the elevator and the shadows crept up to and over me. The diesel generators of the train engines would be rising and falling as they paced back and forth in the switchyards behind the elevator as they pieced together sections of train. Their movements would be short at first, and then longer and longer as they had to travel further and further out to build the train. Eventually they'd pull out of town and then the next train would be building. Sometimes trains just rolled through town and paid no attention to the little town. They'd be carrying coal, oil, rock, steel I-beams or something that I didn't really recognize, and I would always wonder where they were from or where they were going. I began to think about how northeast Minneapolis and my own little hometown might be connected, specifically in terms of agriculture. I went to Google Maps, I pulled up northeast Minneapolis, and I found the building that I was in. Once I found it, I zoomed out a little bit, and then I followed that railroad down out of Minneapolis and out west of town, and then it curled to the southwest at Willmar, and I followed it across all of Minnesota. Mile after mile, town after town, I followed those tracks. Click, drag, release, click, drag, release, click, drag, release. I was more than halfway down the state of Minnesota, and I was becoming more and more certain of where this little journey by satellite imagery was taking me. A few more scrolls and my suspicions were completely confirmed. I slowed down as I reached Jasper, Minnesota. And then I slowed down even more as I hit Sherman, South Dakota. And my heart swelled when I saw my hometown of Garrettson roll into view. There I was, looking down from space on the switchyard of tracks behind the elevator that sat behind the main street that I knew so well. When I zoomed in, I could see right where my dad used to park, and the steps that I would sit on and wait for him so I could go home for dinner. I realized that our family had left Garrettson and I'm not a part of it anymore, but it's still very much a part of me. It's in my heart and it's in my mind. I just moved down the tracks 30 miles. I'm still the same man, but also a new man, hopefully a better man. I've had the fortune of visiting many other places all over this great country, and I've had ample opportunities to pull up my roots and replant somewhere else. But after almost 48 trips around the sun, I've grown pretty attached to this Dakota soil that my family and I have